Activists and advocates for the homeless took over an abandoned building in Dublin, Ireland in December, drawing attention to the growing number of people on the streets. This week, campaigners struck a deal with the government that would provide more housing to those in need.
But as you just saw, the fight isn't over. Not everyone is convinced their short and long-term demands will be met. We'll speak to people on the ground about the challenges they're facing and how to move forward. I'm Malika Bilal.
I'm Femi Okay, and you're in the stream. Homelessness isn't a new issue for Ireland, but the recent occupation of an abandoned building in the capital has been making waves on and offline. Wednesday was the court-ordered deadline to vacate the premises.
Home Sweet Home campaigners and others in solidarity have been mobilizing with the help of a few hashtags. Apollo House, the name of the occupied building, is one of the main ones. Activists have used it and other tags to share images, videos, and live updates. On Wednesday, protesters formed a human chain around Apollo House to prevent residents from being evicted. The movement has the backing of many Irish celebrities, as you see there. Activists have also received food, beds, and raised more than $180,000. And they're keen to get the word out. We've had an overwhelming response from Twitter users in Ireland weighing in, and the discussion continues. Join in with hashtag AJStream.
Is it too much to ask in a modern Ireland that we shouldn't have everybody sleeping on the streets? And coming from a famine country where everybody was displaced and had to leave, we think we should be in the forefront of ending homelessness. It's a disgrace. It's got to stop. It's unacceptable. Get the people off the streets.
Homelessness in Ireland is on the rise. Rent increases in the past 4 years. Housing shortages and austerity measures are just some of the factors contributing to the number of people on the streets.
Following negotiations this week, the government agreed to set up 2 emergency accommodation units for those living in Apollo House. Housing Minister Simon Coveney said addressing homelessness is his top priority, and there will be no families in commercial housing by July 1st.
To help us talk about this, we're joined by Tommy Gavin, spokesperson for Irish Housing Network. He's coming to us from Dublin. Karen Murphy is Director of Policy at the Irish Council for Social Housing in Dublin. Matt Carty is a member of the European Parliament, coming to us from Brussels. And Kieran Cuff is a Dublin City Councillor. We also reached out to the Housing Minister, Coveney, but his office said he was unable to take part in this live discussion. But to everybody else, it's good to have you. Tommy, you're really close to Apollo House. If you could describe the atmosphere today, inside and outside, what would you tell us?
I suppose I would say that the atmosphere inside Apollo House was it was slightly disappointed in that as far as we were concerned, we had reached an amicable agreement with the minister over the weekend, but we had 8 residents come back and represented Apollo House because of not just the fact that the accommodation they were offered was substandard, but it was actually unsafe. We're talking about biohazard, blood on the walls, blood on the sheets, vomit on the floor. One of the reasons Apollo House was taken over in the first place was the homeless crisis and the housing emergency in Ireland. Now, the position of the government and the housing department has been to say that there are enough beds to deal with the crisis. However, clearly, the beds are unsafe, and this is something we've been saying consistently throughout the campaign.
We've been talking to a lot of our online community, and this is one comment from Mark Felt. It's not commercial housing. It's talking about Apollo House here. It's an ugly abandoned office block due for demolition, but it's better than the official accommodation provided. Karen, do you concur?
Well, the accommodation that's provided for emergency accommodation really is, I suppose it's something that's not ideal. Nobody wants to be providing emergency accommodation. The long-term provision of homes is really what we're about. Certainly from housing associations' perspective, we prefer to be looking at providing people with a long-term secure tenancy and not to be even talking about emergency accommodation. But unfortunately, we're in this position now because we're dealing with the fallout of basically a very long-term and deepening housing crisis that has led to increasing levels of homelessness, economic evictions, rising rents, people living in accommodation that are basically they can't afford, they're in arrears with their mortgages. Just the number of problems with the Irish housing market is really, it's almost like a perfect storm of what goes wrong when a property bubble is allowed to get out of control. People are allowed to, and encouraged indeed, to get in over their heads. And this happened in the US also with actual mortgage debt. And then eventually, as the economy collapsed in the economic crash, one of the first things to be cut, unfortunately, was provision and funding for social housing. So, it's inevitable when you have this sort of deepening housing crisis with individuals living in unstable, insecure tenancies that are subject to rising rents that they can no longer afford. That an emergency issue will arise and people will become homeless.
And Karen, it's because of that crisis that you're describing, very vividly there, that you have people online saying, well, that's why those who are without a home need more time to be able to find accommodation that's right for them. This is Peter Gowan on Twitter. He says, it's ridiculous for the government and for the High Court to ask Home Sweet Home Ireland to leave Apollo House before everyone has decent accommodation. Here, though, is a picture of what some of this accommodation looks like that's not so decent. Some would say. This is from Home Sweet Home's Twitter account. Wondering what we mean by standards, one resident took these photos in the place he was offered today and refused. You can see some Twitter pictures there, and of course we can't independently corroborate this, but you can see what looks like, dirty walls, small beds, a chipping plaster there. Kieran, when you see this and you read the tweet that was before it saying that people need proper accommodation, what do you say to that?
Well, I agree, and I think if there is problems with substandard accommodation, it makes sense for people to say, look, I don't want that. I want to go back to what I have in Apollo House, which I think has been amazing over the last 2 or 3 weeks. But we do know that the majority of people who've left Apollo House have stayed in the accommodation that they were provided. The Peter McVerry Trust have confirmed, I think 75 people have stayed with the accommodation that they've been offered. But look, I think the stories I'm hearing today and yesterday indicate that we need to make sure that the emergency accommodation is better equipped and is up to speed. And that's certainly a message I'll be bringing back to the officials in the Housing Department of Dublin City Council.
Let's just get some reality here, reality check. I'm going to go via this Twitter page. This is Erica Fleming, at Erica Home One. Erica describes herself as a Dublin mother of one, forced to raise my daughter in a cramped hotel room. We're talking about homelessness in Ireland, Erica. You've experienced that, you're experiencing that. What do you want to add to this conversation? What's important that we're not missing, that we're not getting to?
That nothing has been done, and it's all a big spin. That they're talking and talking and talking, but they don't want to fix the issue. Myself and my daughter are 19 months homeless. We live in a hotel room. We share a bed. We have no cooking facilities, no washing facilities. We eat takeaway every single night. My child can't have friends over, and this is acceptable to this government.
Let me just bring in Matt. We're talking about one particular facility. It's not even an official facility. It's an office block that was used for homeless people to live in. Matt, but Apollo House, this has got to be a metaphor for something bigger that's going on in Ireland and with accommodation. How would you extrapolate from what we're seeing with one situation and how that's affecting the rest of Ireland?
Absolutely. I think some of the speakers, particularly Karen, have outlined in very clear terms why it is and some of the issues that have underlined the housing crisis that we see in Ireland. But I think what is really important for viewers to understand is this isn't an accident. This isn't something that has simply come out of control. This is actually the natural outworking of official government policy over the past number of decades, in fact, when governments decided in effect to privatise the provision of social housing. So one of the things, ironically, that we did not great, but better than some countries in some of the darkest periods economically of Irish history over the past number of years, was actually provide social housing. Now, we made lots of mistakes. We built too many houses together without having social facilities and all the rest. But I'm a product. I come from a council housing estate in County Monaghan. In latter years, as a member of a local authority, I chaired the council's Housing Strategic Policy Committee. And it was plain for anybody to see that we were heading towards an unmitigated disaster, whereby rather than actually providing social housing and building houses for people who needed them and who would never be able to afford in the short or medium term mortgages, the government and successive governments instead encouraged those people into private rented subsidised accommodation, and in many ways that was actually the crux of the property crisis and the economic crash that we've seen, and the outworking more recently has been a homelessness crisis.
Right, let me just bring back Erica. Erica, go ahead, and Karen, we'll come to you in a moment. Erica, yeah.
The fact of the matter is that the council have land that they actually own, and they're selling that for private development instead of building social housing for the people that need it. So they're not willing to help the most vulnerable in society. It's all aimed at the private rental sector.
Karen?
Yeah, I do think there has been, like over the last 10 years, there's been an over-reliance on the private rented sector to provide a solution for people who need social housing. And I think that has been shown to have a limited value, that you can't rely on a private housing market to provide for the needs of an entire population. And that is basically the housing market, the private housing market has been a failed private housing market for the last number of years. So we know we can't rely on purely private rented accommodation, but I do think it's important to point out that there is a housing action plan in place that has been there since July of last year. It followed on from a previous one that was there for 2 years. And again, within those housing action plans, there's still a reliance on the private rented sector to provide for people who really need social housing. But also there is an emphasis on, the provision by local authorities and housing associations. And I think that's particularly where we want to be able to come in, is in providing long-term homes that are secure, a long-term alternative for people. And Erica's already mentioned there about local authority sites, and there's over 700 or so sites in public ownership and state ownership that I think we should be, either local authorities should be delivering on them, or if not, housing associations, because in a sense that's vacant sites. And Apollo House is an example of basically a derelict building, but I think we should be using those vacant sites that we own to actually build and develop and provide long-term housing for people.
So Tommy, I know you want to get in there, and I saw you shaking your head when Matt was speaking. So I want to go to you with this, but I want to bring in the voice of two people online. This is Peter McVeary Trust, is an organization who says the very limited availability of affordable and secure homes, low-cost rentals, social housing is both a cause and a barrier to exiting homelessness. Now, someone else elucidates it even more clearly. This is a video comment we got from Cormac Fitzgerald, who talks about this being a problem that affects maybe not just a person who might come to mind when you think of homelessness, but it affects families, as we heard a little bit earlier from Erica. Here's Cormac. This is what he had to say.
In families, many times with very young children, staying in hotels in cramped rooms with no access to proper cooking or cleaning facilities. Common complaints with this type of accommodation include mold and damp in rooms, antisocial behaviour, drug use, and bedbug infestations. Now, the Apollo House occupation has to do with conditions in a more traditional type of homeless accommodation for adults, like shelters or hostels.
So Tommy, he talks about families there. Is it your view that they are being priced out of the market?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's anyone is disputing that. I mean, the housing crisis in Ireland has, without a doubt, reached an emergency level. And Apollo House, I think, is an expression of the social movement arising in Ireland for the right to housing. I mean, you can point to any dimension of it, and it's a complete disaster. I mean, there's 140,000 people on the social housing waiting list who should be getting social housing. And the three main reasons that people are becoming homeless today in Ireland is rising rents, and it's unemployment, and it's people who are falling out of direct provision, which is what fundamentally amounts to detention centres for people who are coming to Ireland from other countries.
Kieran, let me just bring you in here because we're hearing a lot of the problems, not hearing too many solutions. I was flicking through your website here and you're calling for vacant sites to be used. We just click on here, you're standing in front of one.
Right, I think so. We've a
here.
lot of empty sites.
It's not like there's not the space in Ireland, is there? What are you suggesting?
That's right, and there's a lot of vacant space in Dublin City. I guess because of the financial crisis for the last 8 years, the government would say they haven't had the money to build housing. They've had the money to build roads and motorways, but not housing. I think we should be diverting a lot of the money into housing. And I think now that particularly the economy in Dublin is picking up, we've got to use the increase in tax revenue to build homes, to build local authority homes, to help housing associations build homes. And we can do that because we have that money now. And the second thing we need to do is provide better support services to those who find themselves homeless. Because a lot of people in homelessness have a lot of underlying issues around drug use, around alcohol, around psychiatric problems. Many people were institutionalized for years. They need a lot of support. There's also a new homelessness of people who've been priced out of the market. And people like Erica, it's really tough. I can only imagine raising a child in a hotel room. There's 2,000 families out there in those kind of circumstances at the moment. They write to me every second day of the week. We've got to reach out and provide more support for people like that.
All right, Kieran, that sounds good. That sounds positive. But Erica is not happy with what you're saying. Erica and then Tommy.
I'm delighted that he agrees about the vacant properties that are around, that they need to be opened up. But
yeah,
the fact of the matter is that when I first became homeless 19 months ago, my child was 7. She's 10. Yeah. That is a huge chunk of a child's, small little childhood, right? And when I'm constantly pointing out boarded up properties to the government officials, they're telling me that we do have the money. We are going to open them up. But there's council-owned flats that are boarded up for more than 2 years. More than 2 years to open up a flat, that doesn't make sense. Like, it's not good. It's so infuriating.
It's not good.
And sorry for a second, Kieran, because when I drive past these places on the way to school with my daughter, and my daughter was asking me, Ma'am, why can't we move in there? Why can't they just take down the boards? Why won't they sign the paper? What am I to tell the child? How can you make sense of it? I can't make sense of it. It's absolutely outrageous. I'm disgusted with this government. I'm disgusted with the last government as well, because the last government came out and said, we now have the money. We are going to start doing something. We will start building houses. We will open up the vacant properties. But none of that has happened. I challenged one minister on a national radio show in October 2015, and that minister told me 18 months to build. When you start building a property to the time somebody moves in, it's 18 months. Now it's 19 months later, and there's still no building happening. So they're saying the funding is there, so they can no longer use that as an excuse. And the private rental sector, people are actually been put into private rents, right? Which is right, fine. That was the government's way.
Erica, you said you're disgusted. I hear the disgust and the sadness really in your voice. You're not the only one. I want to bring up a tweet from the handle Something Murphy. The government should decommodify housing and people should intensify campaigns of direct action. This is a local and international situation. So this was tweeted by someone who's with us live. I want to bring in one more voice to this conversation. That's Connor Murphy. He's a community activist who's been tweeting in all throughout this crisis, really. He's coming to us live with his thoughts. Connor, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I just think about everyone's talking about these vacant properties. I mean, I've been involved in the last 6 or 7 years in opening up these vacant properties and housing people. The first course of action is that there's an attempt to evict us from those properties, whether we're using them for houses or social services or community spaces. And these spaces are essentially being sold off to what people are calling vulture funds. They're not exactly vulture funds because usually these companies would buy the property and sell them quickly for a turnover, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that we have giant companies who are coming in and buying whole lots or whole swaths of buildings, and they're here to stay. And this is a part of the problem. These companies see housing as a commodity and only as a commodity, and this has been a part of government policy. Like our politicians go abroad to find these people these companies to invest in these vacant sites. Like I haven't seen, on in real life, all I've seen is these vacant properties being occupied and evicted, non-stop.
Well,
So
I think we need both. I think we
there's-
need the direct housing from the councils, from Dublin City Council and others. We also need the investment, and I'm not against bringing companies into Ireland to provide housing if they can provide decent conditions at affordable rents. That's great, because we do have a long history of really crummy landlords in Ireland who own one or two flats and who are raising the rent month by month. So we've got to have greater rent controls, and we've got to get a variety of different funding from decent landlords to large companies. We need all of that, and we need city councils to provide housing themselves.
If I could come in there, the answer is never going to be vulture funds and these large private entities that have no interest in the social provision of housing. I disagree with a point that you made earlier on in terms of why we didn't build houses during the crisis, and most of what you said I would support. But this wasn't about money. Remember, at the same time, we invested €64 billion of money into bailing out the banks. This was actually a policy position based on ideology. The reason social houses weren't provided...
I'm just going to hurry you, Matt, I'm going to hurry you along a bit because we're right at the end of this part of the programme. If you can make it in a sentence, Matt, because we've got more time, but we'll take you to the post-show. And I just want to squeeze in one more thought. Go ahead, Matt. Finish up quickly.
The reason houses weren't built during the depth of the recession was because it was government policy to try and drive up the prices of houses within the private market, and they felt that the provision of social housing supply would depress houses or flatline houses. So in other words, the profits of speculators was more important than houses for families who needed them.
Matt, just take a pause for a moment, and guess, take a pause for a moment. There's one thing that I'm sure that our audience are watching, and they're thinking, Ireland is a developed country. Why are they having this major issue with homelessness? Why is it a crisis there? Tommy, what would be your response to that?
They're right in saying that that the main reason is the commodification of housing, and that it has been government policy to try to drive up the price of property, and that is the current policy. It's also worth saying that Apollo House was not merely a vacant building; it was a vacant NAMA building. So NAMA was the National Asset Management Agency. It was a bad bank set up to take over toxic loans from banks, so Apollo House was bought with a toxic loan from Anglo-Irish Bank.
So Tommy, let's get back to that original thought, because we're talking big picture here, because not everybody's going to know about Apollo House, where it is, and the ramifications of it. But big picture, Ireland, developed nation, rich compared to a lot of other nations, and you have homelessness as a problem. Because why?
Because of the sense that how central property and construction has been to the Irish economy, and so it's a huge problem now that it has government policy is it's trying to recover by driving up the price of property, and that is making people homeless today. There's 30% more homeless people now than there were last year in Ireland.
There's so much more to talk about. We're taking all of our guests online to our online post show. That's at stream.aljazeera.com. Tweet us at #AJStream. You can be part of that conversation as well. For now, thanks for watching. Hello, welcome to our online post show. So much to talk about, so many guests to talk to as well. I'm going to start off though with Malika Bilal and our online community.
Well, just before we headed into the post show, we were talking about vulture capitalists and that being the problem. This is a tweet we got from Martin McMahon, who was listening to this conversation. He said, vultures do what vultures do. Lack of regulation, though, by government is the key factor. So on that point, we got this tweet from Electro Boy, who says, actually, it will not be the government addressing this. They've had ample opportunity and failed. It's now up to the ordinary people. Kieran, when you see that dichotomy right there, someone saying we need government regulation and someone else saying, no, the government's not going to help us, where do you fall?
I think we need a bit of both. I think councils, local authorities are in it for the long haul. We've been providing housing for 100 years. We need to do more. And I think we spoke a lot about a bad bank earlier. I think that bad bank, NAMA, needs to be transformed into a housing provider as the Irish economy recovers.
Erica, go ahead.
I respect what you're saying, but I just also need to call out these stats. In 2015, 75 houses, local authority houses were built. In 2016, 117 houses were built. Dublin City Council or the local authority are not really putting much or enough pressure onto the government. I would also like to ask, why hasn't the government went to the EU and called or declared a national housing emergency? How many times do we have to keep saying it's a housing emergency? We need help now, today.
Let me show you something here. This is from Streets Kitchen, and this is a solidarity protest being held in London, kind of roundabout now. Hashtag Home Sweet Home, hashtag Homes Not Hostels. It feels like what's happening in Ireland is not an isolated issue. What's happening in Ireland is happening in other countries around Europe. Tommy?
I mean, of course, there's a housing crisis in most major cities in the world right now. And that is because of housing and property being treated as something that it's about financialization, really. It's about as a financial the place of property and housing in financial markets.
I'm just looking here. It's Minister Coveney's statement on homelessness. Three big things here. This is the deal that was done with the Apollo House protesters. 3 new facilities coming up, 40% increase in homeless funding, longer term housing. Connor, what do you make of that?
It's difficult for me to look at all these statements, and there's amazing groups. I availed of some of these services when I was in my late teens. And there's amazing services out there for people who are struggling to find a place to live. Simon Coveney is the Minister for Housing, and he's making himself irrelevant. Like, all he has done is pointed to NGOs, or charities. Like, this is something the state needs to take responsibility for. And all I've heard Simon Coveney is to try and relinquish responsibility for the housing, what's essentially is a housing emergency in Ireland. So I can't listen to Simon Coveney anymore. I don't know what to make of anything he says anymore.
If I can just come in, I think a large part of this is just the scale of the problem. It's just so overwhelming. The number of people that need to be housed in social housing is over 90,000 households, over 7,000 people homeless. And then the numbers in the private rented sector that are in vulnerable tenancies, either because their landlord is in arrears, or indeed they own their own home, but they're in arrears to their bank. So I think it's just the overall scale of the problem is so huge, that there are things being done and that there are plans in place.
Those things are making it worse, though.
It's so slow and so it's such a difficult and slow and long process in providing housing and homes, that it's not dealing with the emergency end of it, and that's why we're seeing the real sharp end of it here with Apollo House.
If you can compare this with other issues, for example, taking the banking crisis, not of the making of ordinary people, yet ordinary people bore the brunt. The Irish government set as a policy to try and restabilise the banks, and by and large they've succeeded. The banking executives are all back to earning their very large salaries. if the same type of approach had been taken to the housing crisis at a very early stage, when people started to warn that this had the potential to become an epidemic, and policymakers concentrated on addressing this by the provision of social housing, then we wouldn't be where we are today. There is no evidence yet that Simon Coveney or anyone within his party or anybody within Fianna Fáil who's supporting the government has the ideological bent or the political will to actually invest the necessary resources to address this. And the only thing that has actually started to mobilise them in that direction has been movements like Apollo House and Home Sweet Home.
I agree with Matt. I think Apollo House has been hugely important in terms of putting pressure on Simon Coveney. I guess what we need now in 2017 is a Marshall Plan. We need the kind of the strength of an all government, all parties in the Dáil to work to provide housing. I don't see that from Simon Coveney's approach. We have had funding for 200 additional homeless beds being provided by Dublin City Council, as you can see in Simon Coveney's statement. But 200 isn't enough. We need to be building tens of thousands of homes at affordable prices every year. And that requires a mobilisation of the building sector, of the government, of the local authorities, of everybody who is able to make a difference.
Kieran, I'm going to play a video comment from someone who completely agrees with you there. This is a video comment we got from someone named Rob Doyle, who is an independent reporter based in Dublin. Here's his story.
The occupation of Apollo House by protesters has really forced the issue of homelessness in Ireland. The government is putting out the narrative that the recovery is in full effect, but when you walk the streets, you can really see that homelessness is at an unprecedented high, especially here in Dublin. It's not only homelessness, it's that a lot of people are being priced out of the city. People my own age, myself included, a working writer, find it increasingly difficult to pay rents and certainly not to own.
And certainly not to own, he says there. So one solution, this is the last one I'll read from our online community. This person says, we need realistic regulation to ensure rents are affordable. Residential housing is a service, it's not an investment.
Guests, thank you so much. We are not over with this conversation. I know we could keep talking for about 3 hours. Erica, I know it feels like you've had your hand up for 3 hours. Give us the last word in this conversation. You've got repetitive hand syndrome there from having your hand up so long. All right, final thought for us from you, who know what it's like not to have a home that you can live in and afford.
Every 4 years, a new minister comes into play and the book is passed. And it's somebody else's problem. And in the 4 years that they've been in government, that wasn't enough time. So when are they actually going to start to tackle this housing emergency? When are they going to go to the EU and declare a national housing emergency?
Guess, thank you so much. You gave us from all your different perspectives such a good unpacking of what's happening with the homelessness crisis in Ireland. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.